So colleagues and friends, thank you for joining us to this conversation with Violet Baffor and Otto Scharmer and myself, Laurel Patterson. I'm our lead of SDG integration at UNDP. I'll let Otto and Violet both introduce themselves. What the three of us are going to be talking about today is systems transformation and how do we identify, how do we start to notice where there's potential points for change. We're calling them acupuncture points for change, and something that Otto has written extensively on. What I want to start with is a reflection on a gap, which we're exploring in the UN system, and we think is an important part of the conversation for you to take forward with your constituencies and colleagues as well too. And that's this: why is there a gap between our individual values and our beliefs and collective action? What happens in that space? Why is it that we can feel committed as individuals to climate change, but as a collective, our behavior doesn't reflect those values? So we're going to explore that a little bit in the conversation, both with Otto and Violet. And I want to make a suggestion on three things that we think you may want to consider, potentially take forward in the discussion with your colleagues as well too. And so framing this is really about how do we align our attention with our intention? And so what does it mean to start to take our individual beliefs into our agency, into a feeling of empowerment and action confidence, and a connection with others to be able to drive systems change? And we know that systems don't change easily. Status quo often prevails. Power structures prevent or limit shifts in many ways, certainly towards positive change in some areas. So we want to propose three main ideas for you to think about. The first is, can we make shifts in the way that we measure? How can we measure outer conditions of well-being differently? So something that you might want to consider is measurements around psychological well-being, around time wealth or time poverty, and around community vitality. What does that mean in your context, and how would you measure it? Because sometimes we do need the data and evidence behind these concepts and ideas so that we can drive action. The second, and something we're also working on at UNDP and the UN system, how do we create open spaces that are multi-stakeholder spaces so that we can start to discuss these challenges openly? What would it look like to take a participatory process that not only enhances your individual agency, but the agency of others? So how can we create and hold those kinds of spaces? How can you do that actively with your constituencies? And again, we'd be happy out of this conversation to share more details about what we're thinking about in that space. And the third is really around leaving no one behind, which is so critical to the decade ahead. And here our challenge back to the group, and something Violet and Otto will be talking about together, is this concept of understanding systems from the periphery. Who are we not hearing? Where are our blind spots? And how do we start to be comfortable with a level of discomfort to really listen into that space, bring people into this collective? And without an ability to do that, we think it'll be fundamentally impossible to drive change. So those are some initial thoughts that I wanted to leave you with. And Otto, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Laurel. You mentioned the knowing doing gap that we all know exists and we all collectively enact. And I think that's really something we should really. Here's what we see there. We see a situation in most big systems today where we collectively enact what nobody wants, right? So we collectively enact results that nobody wants. Examples is, includes massive environmental destruction, loss of biodiversity, inequality, polarization, and also all the mental health and burnout issues that we know are so rampant. So we collectively create results that no one wants. And how actually can we bridge the knowing doing gap that you mentioned? And I think there are really two leverage points. One is when you have this knowing doing gap, which is kind of a disconnect between the head and the hand on the level of the collective. The only way of bridging that is obviously to activate the intelligence of the heart. So there is something we need to do in terms of a different kind of leadership. So that's one thing. But the other thing has to do with the transformation of the collective. And in particular, I would say that it's transformation of our economy. And I just want to list for our conversation here the 7 acupuncture points that from an economic perspective, I think really require our attention, because very interesting things are already going on. And yet they require more attention so that we can accelerate the transformation in each of them. And most of them will be quite familiar to you. So I will just kind of name them with one sentence each. Nature, and as I go through the 7 acupuncture points, it's really just going through a modern day production function. So we start with nature. Nature really, we see a shift from a linear to a circular economy, particularly in terms of agriculture, right? From a factory farming and industrial agriculture to regenerative agriculture. Then in terms of labor, we move from jobs or the lack thereof to purpose-driven work or to meaningful work. And I think it's really interesting, UBI, kind of universal basic income. The administrator, Achim Steiner, mentioned this number the other day, that I think it's a fraction of the debt service of the global south that's currently in 2020 was transferred to the global north financial institutions, would have been sufficient to cover universal basic income, basically for the population in the global south. I think it's coming. It's just a question when, and it's another leverage point here on that dimension. Capital, from extractive to regenerative. Regenerative meaning focusing on the regeneration of our commons, ecological, social, cultural commons. Technology is number 4. From creativity diminishing to creativity enhancing technologies. A distinction rarely applied today, but very applicable when we deal with the issues and the promises of technology. Number 4, management. From hierarchies, hierarchical management and silos to ecosystem leadership and co-creativity. And then number 6, on the consumption side, from GDP, or bigger is better, to well-being of planet and people. Rachel, kind of, you mentioned kind of time, as a dimension, right? So if you go to Bhutan, the GNH metrics has time, right? So as a key resource there, we have the HDI kind of in the UN community. There are other metrics. I think really kind of metrics for capturing economic progress in terms of well-being of both planet and people. And then lastly, of course, we talk about a transformation of governance, a transformation of the coordination mechanism that we apply for our onto our systems, from only relying on markets and hierarchies towards something we call awareness-based collective action, by which I mean bringing together the key stakeholders of the system and taking them on a journey of deep sense making of what's working, what's broken in the current system, and how we can realign attention and intention in that system towards creating results that are more aligned with the intention that the key players in the system have. That's something we see already. We see it in CSA, kind of community-supported agriculture. We see it also on a macro scale. Say, take the Paris Agreement. Yes, we are at the very beginning, but that is a dimension of evolution of governance, which is really at the heart of the current transformation we are all in.
This is so interesting, Otto. Thank you, because working in Liberia and having worked in different parts of the world in development, this is exactly what we as UNDP are now focusing on and working more intensely in. And really, what is it? It's our work in terms of moving from the individual to collective action is for us to see ourselves, for us seeing ourselves, UNDP, as an individual. And how do we build partnerships to influence the right things for change. And I think this is, for us, what we do at country level. And maybe what I will do now is to say, for us, the acupuncture point in UNDP requires building coalitions for change and transformation. And here I want to say, I want to ask a question, right? How do we do this practically at country office level? And we see this done at corporate level as well. And practically just looking at our experience here, it is by looking outside of UNDP. We must, and we use approaches that leverage our work to multiply for transformation. So what does all of this mean? And I want to take a very practical example. For us in Liberia, what's the latest or most recent issue that we're working on, to put in practical terms what we said earlier, is identifying the issue of women's participation in the political sphere. And here it's a fundamental change in Liberia, where we're asking, or we supported the national counterparts, the Electoral Commission as well as civil society, to make a change in the electoral laws. And here what they're asking for is a 30% quota for women to participate in political decision making. It may seem like a small number, but here it's huge. It is significant, and significant enough that we're seeing some resistance. And what we're doing is supporting national counterparts to build their coalition. And we as UNDP are building a partnership with our development partners in country to support this national movement, to drive this change. And this is a typical example of what we're working on now, and how we build partnerships to influence the right things for the transformation that we want to see.
Violet, thank you. I mean, you've made it very clear and practical and applied, the way that these coalitions need to be considered and nurtured and sustained. And Otto, back to an earlier point that you had mentioned, I want to put this back for this constituency as well too, that understands coalition building, I think, very well. You talked about, in this gap of knowing and doing, a gap of the head and the hands, that the solution is in the heart. And I want to put back to this group something that is a little radical, I would say, the work that we're exploring with our colleagues in the UN system, which is reimagining the role of passion, of emotion, of feeling in shifting systems. And Otto, I think you've pointed to the fact that without that, systems don't change. I doubt any of you listening into this can think of a social movement, think of a major shift in society that happened without emotion, without heart and passion and feeling, and the commitment of a collective to something that was beyond something that could be measured or could be implemented within a certain timeline. This is what we think is needed, and certainly something we want to vitalize in the UN system. So Otto, here's my question. Coming out of the disruption of COVID, people are tired. So COVID is an opportunity for change and transformation. We understand that people are tired, and we're asking them to show up fully. We're asking them to show up with their whole selves and hearts and passion. What would your advice be, or what are your insights and reflection on what it takes to sustain these kinds of movements and collective action?
Well, it's interesting, Laurel. The problem today is not that we don't have emotions in our systems, right? So the problem is that we have destructive emotions. So it's hate, it's not compassion and empathy. And and yet we as human beings and any kind of system is capable to both, right? So we are not wired one way or another, kind of human beings, we know that from our own lives. So I think leadership, what is leadership there? It's kind of, can we activate, can we create environments, Violet, that does what you were describing, which is building coalitions for transformation. And so the polarization that we see in so many countries advancing, right? So that's not gone. So that's advancing. How can we meet that, right? With really infrastructures that activate the human capacity to co-sense, to really connect. And so I want to share an experience and then, close with a question to you, Violet, because I have been doing that really for many years, right? Helping multi-stakeholder groups with very different, if not conflicting interests, to move from a more antagonistic to a more co-creative way of operating. That's hard to do. But the trick is usually not talking about emotions. It's not talking about all the nice values that we may share or not, or ideologies, right? Because the ideologies will be different. But what I found most effective is taking people on a journey, make them meet other people, particularly at the margin of the system, with their own eyes, teach them how to listen, how to dialogue. And that instantly shifts the awareness from a silo view, me, to an ecosystem awareness, where I begin to see how unintentionally my own behavior is impacting another person and what might be done. So it creates a more co-creative environment. And I think, so that's what I have been seeing by basically getting out of your own bubble, getting out of your own silo, getting together on the ground and activate these deeper fields of co-sensing and listening. And that's hard to do because often the supporting infrastructures for that are missing. So my question to you is, where have you that seeing going on? So you mentioned two examples, youth and women leadership. And what are the enabling conditions for that? And what's missing for you? If, let's say, the headquarter from the UN or someone else, what is missing for you on the ground to make that happen more at scale?
Okay. Thank you, Otto. I mean, that's an incredible question. And I would say maybe a couple of things. For us, working at country level, you're absolutely right. Making that shift, putting different groups together to co-create is not an easy task. I wouldn't use it's challenging or difficult, but it's not an easy task. And what we're doing here in Liberia with the two examples that I've given is really asking one question, which is, what is that future that you see for Liberia? And the term here we use is Mama Liberia. So what is that future that you see for the youth in Mama Liberia? How do you see this future? How can we co-create that vision together, or that path together to get to where you see? Because more often than not, they have the same vision. It's just the emotions, and you said it right, the negative emotions that come from different divergent interests that get in the way and create this noise. So how are we able to tap into or reignite the positive emotion and energy and patriotism that drives sustainable development? And that's what we tap into. I think what UNDP is doing, and we need more of this, and I would say two things. One, I would say the sense-making initiatives that we're doing now, not just in UNDP, but in the spirit of building coalitions for transformation. We need this, not just the UN, but beyond the UN, our national partners, civil society, so that we're creating these powerful movements and moving the needle in the right direction. That's one. The other, I would say, would be building at scale an initiative that allows us and provides the tool, and in a way it's linked to sense making, provides the tools that we can share with our partners for how you begin to co-create, i.e., how do you begin with the end in sight? And that's exactly it. So how do you come to that part where you say, this is that vision that we want for whether it's Liberia or Rwanda or Tajikistan, this is it. And now how are we able to get there? Because it is a continuous journey where you will need to check in and keep people on that path where they're tapped into the positive energy and emotion that is needed to drive that change. Laurel, with that, I hope I've given you enough to help us at country level.
Violet and Otto, thank you so much. There's only so much that can be said or done in 15 minutes, but for colleagues that are watching, I hope this gives you a sense of what's on our mind. I hope this gives you a sense of some of the entry points, some of the acupuncture points, the nudges in certain areas that we think have the potential to transform systems. And I hope we've also empowered you in a way to act in this space as well, to create these spaces for yourselves and others, and be courageous. Ask yourself those difficult questions about who's not in the room and who's not in the table. And as Otto said, you know, ignite your own journey in this respect and bring colleagues along with you. And I think this is our work in the Decade of Action. So Violet, Otto, thank you both so much. And for colleagues listening, hope you all enjoyed and have a good day and afternoon wherever you are.